enabling us to meet and to share our ideas and the papers and to discuss. I'll just start my presentation. Okay. It's something that I called a lost step. It's was cultural historical archaeology late in Serbia, and is it a good or bad thing, and why was it late, and how the other paradigms then emerged? Culture history is the leading paradigm. I don't have to tell you that in Europe and North America during the first half of the 20th century, and it became dominant in the Serbian archaeology only after the Second World War. Something that we call now culture historical archaeology has different intellectual traditions. The concept of cultural group as a common archaeological traces appearing constantly associated over a certain territory was the result of a diverse transfer of knowledge and intellectual traditions. You can see only some here, but as well particularly local schools and thought collectives, and even authoritative individuals. And the idea was influenced, of course, by the 19th century Scandinavian systematization, indirectly Niederle, Gordon Child, you can see them here, Merhart, even Cosina, with famous Cosina syndrome, we must not forget that. But how that affected Serbian, and I shall mention a wider Yugoslav archaeological tradition. Somehow like bouncing pool balls in the development of interpretative styles and archaeological practices in Serbia. What is apparent are specific characteristics as well as the importance of the dominant individuals. Very dominant individuals and authorities. And the idea of cultural group as the crux of cultural historic archaeology entered the Serbian science indirectly from different directions in a manner of pool balls bouncing of several rails. So it was not understood in the same fashion, for example, in late 19th, early 20th century in successive generations such Miloje Vasić or Miodrag Grbić during the Second World War and immediately before and after, or Milutin Garašanin and Dragoslav Serević after the Second World War. So it had a somewhat irregular trajectory. And that irregular trajectory, I think, is dominant elsewhere as well. It's not so neat. Paradigms don't shift so neatly. And the development and specific traits move along this irregular trajectory, point to the shortcoming of this simplified, schematized pattern of linear sequences of paradigms, cultural, historical, processual, post-processual, and so on. What is rather curious and apparent is that Serbian archaeology had a chance to be in the position to establish some kind of cultural, historical, interpretative framework comparatively early, by the beginning of 20th century, thanks to this man and his anthropogeographical school. This is Jovan Cvijić, famous geographer and anthropogeographer, and it was he was in the circle of German and French anthropogeographer of the time, and it is compatible to the German and Austrian and even French anthropological theory of Kulturkreis Lehre. For us, speaking today, it is all the same. This notion of archaeological cultural group, it was not a simple, direct reflection of the anthropological concept of cultural circles or cultural areas in German and Austro-Hungarian archaeologists, anthropologists, and archaeologists, and even in other contexts. Now we think that it's more or less that they are the fruits of the same tree, and in a way they are, but in their time they were heavily opposed and theories were heavily disputed between Ratzel and Bastian, Schmidt, Boas. It was not, and Twitch was a prominent member of those discussions, and it was not so simple. And this idea of cultural group is not just a simple reflection. For example, Twitch didn't speak about cultural circus, but he spoke about cultural belts of civilization. And when he wrote this thesis about belts of civilization, Byzantine, Oriental, and so on, there were not even archaeological groups in the Balkans defined, not even elsewhere for that matter. And his zones of civilizations reach across the whole peninsula. For example, this is Dinaric and cattle breeders zone of civilization. You can see it goes from Slovenia, Istria to the Romanian Bulgaria in this belt. And there were, of course, some ideological and national program behind his idea. It's it's been discussed and commented later. But what is important in this point is that small archaeological community at the time, and I'm speaking about Serbia and wider Western Balkans, did not accept the idea of Twitch concerning cultural belt circles or his critique, and I think that was the reason, critique of the idea of deep cultural continuity in the Balkans from prehistory to the modern times. He was against this idea of continuity, and it was very dear, as we shall see, to archaeologists and some others. So what did actually Serbian archaeologists reject in this concept of cultural belts, which could be, of course, transformed into early idea of archaeological cultures, at least theoretically, not practically? It was actually the continuity. Continuity is idea fix and a leitmotif of Serbian and wider Yugoslav archaeology up to modern times, from late 19th, early 20th century. You can see here a prominent archaeologist, Mile Vasic, who was the most important figure in Serbia archaeology for 50 years, first half of 20th century, then Milan Budimir, a famous linguist, and Čajkanović, ethnologist and anthropologist, and also classical studies. So in archaeology, classical study, and linguistics, there were all very fond of this idea of continuity, and it remained very important in archaeological interpretation. For example, Mile Vasic spoke as early as 1905 that the boundaries of spheres of individual cultural centers in the Balkans have almost stayed throughout the subsequent times from the Neolithic onwards, and they didn't change. It was something similar. Dragoslav Srejović said in the late 20th century, when he said, and that's why I portrayed him thus, as if the whole Balkan Peninsula was ripped in two halves. And when it happened in deep prehistory, even before Neolithic, and it remained ripped to the very day, all cultures were on one or other side of this great divide. So this idea was very persistent in Serbian archaeology and in wider Yugoslav archaeology as well. At that time, the paradigm of cultural historical archaeology was emerging in Europe from very similar concept that Cvijić had here, cultural circles, culture area, and so on, but not in Serbia because of this idea of continuity. Cvijić was referred to very heavily whenever archaeologists in Serbia wants to speak about geography, about what is Balkan Peninsula, what is Central Balkan, what is Western Balkan, what is Eastern Balkan, Southern Balkans, and so on. He goes to Cvijić and quotes Cvijić, but that's some sort of ritual invocation, if I may say so. It was not his idea of cultural belts that was mattered from which some sort of archaeological culture could emerge. Later, after the Second World War, we can see that the definition of archaeological cultures in various national archaeology, not only in former Yugoslavia, not only in Serbia, but wider as well in the Balkans and elsewhere, was based on different methodological and ideological grounds. Cultural groups were multiplied over the time. That was a process you all know, or that process, and they were fragmented and almost squeezed. Stasha Babić spoke about it earlier, almost squeezed into national, republic, and later state borders. You could always see that somehow prehistoric cultures are very similar to former republic borders in Yugoslavia or state borders nowadays. And then this Cvijić's idea of continuity was very explicit. Cvijić's critique, of continuity was very explicit. He explicitly rejected the idea of cultural continuity with the earlier times, especially prehistory. He said, if there is any continuity, it's only in modern times after the Turkish period or so. So not even with the medieval period, there is no continuity. That's what archaeologists didn't like, because the idea of continuity was the core of their interpretation. Something mystically called the continuity of the Balkan substrate. I never could understand, but it's a term very often referred to. It's a deep Balkan substrate. It's something emerging from the depths of the Balkan soil, and it somehow transforms into a culture, and it can be shown and it can be seen in continuity. For example, this ethnological case of Rusalje, who fall in a certain trance while dancing and singing, This is continuity with the Dionysian tradition, with Greeks and so on. And it is so appealing that it appears in many interpretations over the whole century. I shall not bother you. This is from one of my earlier works on and papers on continuity. But you have in Serbian archaeology different types of continuity. One is culture transmission of cultural tradition. This is so pure cultural historic continuity. But of course, there are some others, national continuity, for example, which is finally becomes pseudo-archaeological, and we have that in various archaeology, not only in the Balkans, but elsewhere as well. Then the basic Herder's idea about Volksseele, Volksgeist, is in Srejić metaphysics, metaphysical continuity of spirit. Then very influential is because of Miloj Vasić, who was the most influential archaeologist in the first half of the 20th century, is this Greek Aegean continuity as a form of this Balkan substrate, but Greece is very important from Bronze Age, and especially archaic and classical Greece, and from Furtwängler and Humboldt and Winkelmann and German studies. This is, of course, some evolutionary unilinear continuity, but not so prominent as the other, as well as characterology. So different types of continuity formed this idea, which was dominant in Serbian archaeology. More important, why was cultural historic archaeology not present in Serbian archaeology is because of Miloj Vasić. Miloj Vasić, his interpretation of Vinča and of his very important Neolithic locality, it was that it was not Neolithic. For about 30 years, excavating Vinča and other, and by that time other Neolithic sites were known as well. His interpretation is that it is Aegean. Those were Aegean settlers, sailors, prospectors, and Aegean colonists from the Bronze Age. And in the whole prehistory of Serbia was actually part of this Aegean influence. And in that kind of interpretation, you don't need cultural historic archaeology. Then later, as perhaps some of you know, he even changed, went further in his erroneous interpretation, stating that Vinča is in fact Ionian Greek colony of the 6th century BC. So only critique, very limited critique of his ideas was present in Serbian archaeology before the Second World War. Fuchs and Grbić and some others. And Grbić, Miodrag Grbić, another figure, was one of the important and perhaps one of the first archaeologists who introduced culture historic paradigm into Serbian archaeology. He was excavating Starčevo and publishing it. And some others like Jankulov, who is rather marginalized, nowadays almost unknown. He did it during the Second World War, not a very fortunate time, but he organized a museum course during the Second World War, sort of parallel university, and in a museum, and he actually introduced in this course the idea of cultural historic archaeology to this generation that would, after the Second World War, become prominent Serbian and Yugoslav archaeologists, art historians, and historians. From those students of this course came actually the first culture historical archaeology after the Second World War. You can see here the most important and prominent figures. And they did made a very strong critique of Vasic's idea about Vinča, but what they did was to establish cultural historical paradigm only after the war, thanks to this generation. And in Slovenia, in Bosnia, in Serbia, I just showing you some more important figures. And another one is Mengin's student, of course, Milojčić, who was working in Germany, and as early as 1949, he made this cultural historical framework of Balkan archaeology, Balkan prehistory. So we have two kinds of networks. One is showing where did the idea came from, and it was from actually from Czech archaeology from Netherlands, because Koršec and Grbić had a PhD. Grbić even studied with Stotsky in Netherlands, and there were mentors and friends of Garašanin, Benac, and colleagues. And this is and Merhart was also very important in this respect, because they were all had some scholarships in Germany with Merhart. Another is Austrian from Hernes, Mengin to Milojčić, and they also influenced. But there's another one as well, a different genealogy. I said the Vasic was very important, and his ideas were dominant in the first half of the 20th century. And those were his students, indeed, but they were also rebels from his idea. So different genealogy from Furtwängler to Vasic, and then to Srejović, Gavela, and some others were also present in Serbian archaeology. And that produced a different kind of cultural historic archaeology. In other words, cultural belts by Cvijić, defined in beginning 20th century, are missed lesson in the history of Serbian culture historical archaeology. The concept of cultural groups came to archaeology later, as you can see, as a influence of Central European influence. And the mighty triad which formed the ideas of Serbian archaeology are authority of a professor of an institution that it embodies, of field work, and material. I shall skip a few slides because I think that I've already spent all my time. But what is important is that because of this lost step, during the first half of the 20th century, the new paradigms of processual and post-processual archaeology appeared in Serbia almost simultaneously. At the same time, this trajectory, as I said, it's irregular trajectory. It was marginal at first, but has also been irregular and with varying degree of influence on the discipline. So it was not very neatly after cultural historic then became processual and post-processual. And it was rather irregular. And now we are faced with new theoretical ideas, with new challenges, and with time, the introduction of more recent interpretative approaches and very welcome multivocality of ideas and a rich ideational pluralism, which is developed in Serbia archaeology now, I'm really proud to say so, is avoiding pragmatic and narrow-mindedness of any theoretical provenience. So the history of this cultural historic archaeology and the subsequent paradigms was not neat, but at least it led to the present pluralism that we have in Serbian archaeology, and as well, and that I'm happy to share with you at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Let me, can you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. You can see the applause. and so, and my actions as well. Very interesting case study. And we keep thinking about our Greek case study, but perhaps we can discuss it later on. Are there any questions? Let's start the discussion. We have plenty of time, at least 1 quarter, even more, slightly more. So is there anybody that would say something, point something, or ask something, Alexander, to start the discussion? I can see hands, so please raise your hand or at least wave your hand in the screen. Yorgo, yes, please.
Thanks. I enjoyed the presentation very much, and I was intrigued by the mention of Vladimir Milojic, which I can definitely appreciate how you see him from your side. From the Greek side, as you probably know, Milojic is also related to his teaching in Heidelberg, and the German projects that were initiated in Central and then in Northern Greece, either by him or by his German students like Hensel and so on. And these brought this kind of continental or Central European culture history into the archaeology of Northern Greece. And in this sense, they brought it closer to, they brought Northern Greece closer to the Balkans, in contrast to the rest of the, Greece, the southern Greece. This move, this tendency has also been linked to a kind of a anti-classicist tendency that appeared in Germany after World War II. And I would like your, I just wanted your comment on this, your reaction on this.
Yes, well, Milojic is a very important figure in European archaeology, of course, but in Serbian archaeology was not spoken openly about Milojic because he went because of the Second World War, and he was, of course, student of Mengin, and he left Serbia during this war and made his PhD in Reich in the Second World War, during the Second World War. So it was always somehow when you mention Milojic's work, but who was Milojic? Well, what was his life story? We never actually understood for a long time. But this is very, very important that you said anti-classic tendency, because the whole emergence, as I try to show, of this after the Second World War, of this cultural history in Serbian archaeology was raised from critique of Vasic, and Vasic was absolutely convinced, it was his idea fix, totally wrong, of course, that because he was a student of Furtwängler, and that he is supposed to find first Aegean, then Greek settlers in the Balkans. They came from Black Sea, and there's even a twin city and in near Olbia, and like Vincha. So this part of Serbian cultural historical archaeology, one part of it. The other part, where was also, and I didn't have much time to speak about it, was from, for example, Dragoslav Srevic, also very, very important figure in Serbian archaeology. He embraced, from one side, Vasic's idea about continuity and cultural history, but his ideas were completely different. He thought about psychological, ethno-psychological ideas. He regarded cultures as living beings with tendencies, with feelings, and so on. So it was rather extreme. This is this other line, other genealogy. But the first one, more important even in Yugoslav terms, because of Benac, because of Korošec, because of Croatian archaeologists, was this critique of Vasic and anti-classic tendency, which was also present in as you very well pointed, in German archaeology. Yeah.
Thanks.
Predrag, do you want? You raised your hand, so please go on.
What Alexander presented is actually quite a typical case with small professional communities, and I believe in most of the countries from where the participants are coming from. I don't know the figure for Greece, to be honest, but we are speaking about very small numbers of archaeologists, professional archaeologists, be it in academia or elsewhere in the country. So such small communities are, of course, much more exposed to personal biographies and to personal inclinations of scholars like Vasic, and I believe we can find similar cases everywhere in our countries here. And my excuse goes for Greece because I don't know really so much the Greek situation. And it's quite typical for this to have some sort of a that all our countries developed in the past some sort of kind of a dynastic principle with a big professor, with someone who made his pedigree, be it with some spectacular site or having other opportunities he sees to. And then in the end, you have a great power, academic, professional power, possibility of steering not just personal career and career of his or her students, but also the course of the archaeological discipline. And Vasic is some quite typical case. Actually, it took probably after the period after the Second World War, when our archaeologists were stabilized, but not so much depending on few heavy names and their ideas and theories. But it takes time to get away from ideas like this. But this is still, and to a certain extent, we are still small communities compared to, let's say, countries like Germany, UK, France, Italy, and so on, which, of course, had much greater critical mass of scholars who could, let's say, filter bad ideas or uncorrected interpretations and so on. And this is how we, the whole area, acted as a sort of a periphery to the centers of excellence where, let's say, the core knowledge about, be it culture, history, or be it other ideas developed. That's it. It's more a comment than a question, because
just thank you, Predrag. Speaking about small communities, they all have this father complex, always a dominant figure. And I remember a comment from one of our colleagues at Milutin Garashanin's funeral, where he said, "But now we are orphans." I'm sorry, it was Strevich. No, Strevich died before. We are orphans. Who is the father of our archaeology? So it was so deeply embedded in idea of that there must be a leading figure, someone who you refer to and ask, Daddy, am I right or not?
This kind of father complex, or however you call it, has also something to do with the history and tradition of the Humboldtian concept of university. You have a masters and you have apprentices. And actually, it's the apprentices who work for master for many, many years and then finally go on. I remember even in Germany, actually, in the 80s, when critique of the old generation raised, was actually a critique of the system, when what they say was that they were perpetuating the ideas of the big men, of the masters, because their apprentices simply spread their ideas. I also remember that in Russian or Soviet archaeology, once I read one text by Leo Klein who was comparing Moscow and St. Petersburg School of Archaeology. And he said, we have two dynasties, St. Petersburg dynasty and Moscow dynasty, and we hate each other. He put it in this way. So this has to do with the way how the knowledge is, how education is organized, how the knowledge. While in the West, you have this competition, not only between masters, but also between generations. It's much more dynamic in these terms. And it's, let's say, they don't use gloves when, when they are competing with each other, at least not so much as maybe traditionally this kind of more, is more present in, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe.
I would like to say something on the Greek case study, but I see three hands, so it's better to, as a chairman, to give speech to Diana and then Jana and Stasa. So Diana, could you please?
Thank you very much. Just briefly, Alexander, I'll be grateful to hear a little bit more about, because I didn't quite get how you see the connection. I could hear what you said about the disconnection between Cvic and the cultural historical paradigm, in the sense that Cvic indeed stressed the lack of continuity between his zones of civilization, and rather stressed the transformations that they underwent over time. But at the same time, Cvic was pointing to, I mean, at the core of his analysis was, of course, the relation of geography to man, and more specifically to psychological types. Therefore, this is why, of course, he is considered one of the fathers of Histoire de Mentalité, and Brodel himself actually took on board his ideas and implemented them also to his specialization of the Mediterranean. So isn't there, my question is, aren't there some more roundabout ways via which Cvic exerted influence on the way, on the archaeological profession? Thank you.
Well, not really. Predrag Novakovic wrote about it, and I wrote about it simultaneously a long time ago. And what Cvic's idea about psychology, types of Dinaric and these and those peoples, went before the Second World War into very dominant idea. And Monica Milosavljevic also wrote about it, of Dvornikovic's ethnocharacterology. And now it is sort of popular in pseudo scientific circles because it proved not to be something that could maintain. So I think with this, they ignored actually Cvic because of his because of this lack of continuity, and did not use his idea about cultural belts, and from which emerged cultural history in Central Europe, in France. So it was there, it was in Serbia. They all perhaps read it, but just didn't want to have anything with it because of that's my idea, because he said there is no continuity, and idea of continuity was crucial to archaeologists and ethnologists and even linguists. It was the core of their idea. So Cvic was not welcomed. They only used this, not even Srejović, who spoke about ethnopsychology and who imagined prehistoric cultures as being with the psychology, with tendency, did not refer to Cvic's idea. That is strange.
Yeah,
so,
this is indeed strange and very interesting because he's an icon. I mean,
in Serbian anthropology, not anymore. They started, that's beside the point, but new program of Serbian anthropology is how to put a stake, like a vampire stake, in Cvic. And I think that Cvic is very important for some other reasons, especially because of this longue durée and connection with the Brodel Annales school. But on the other hand, Cvic is not very popular because, of course, of his connection with this psychological types and even physical anthropological types. This is for Denise, this idea of brachychronization with national, you could see his belts and then ethnical maps. It was used after First World War very heavily, and critique of that is, of course, normal. So that is one of the more reasons that Cvic is not even now popular, nor in Serbian archaeology or in Serbian anthropology. That is strange,
okay,
in spite of his very important work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess since this conference is about discussion, I guess we can take 5 more minutes for some questions. Jana, do you want to switch on your microphone?
Yeah. Hi. First of all, hi to you all. Secondly, I have just a quick question for Alexander. What is your view on cultural historical archaeology? What do you think? Should we break from it? I mean, break from the idea that the culture, material culture, like Vinča, Starčevo, and all of that, are one and the same as the people, in terms of ethnicity and linguistics and all of that? Or should we view the material culture just as that, a material culture or some kind of a style, for example? No. If you understand me.
Yes, I understand you perfectly. I consider archaeological culture as a technical term, not especially the whole idea of abuse of ethnicity and ethnocultural unity is something that deserved to be criticized, and it was criticized in archaeology, from processual to post-processual archaeology, and even here. So no, I just regard it as an idea of the past. I'm not. I even said that I'm not very sad that it is gone. it is one part of archaeological history, history of archaeological ideas. What I was saying is that it was stronger here and in a period where when it was fading away in for example, in States and in Western Europe, because we had a lost step. And I tried to explain why was this step lost. About 50 years. It could, it's just something that we missed in this ideal neat typology of idea, which of course doesn't exist. But my opinion of cultural history or archaeology is, of course, that it is, especially this connection with ethnicity. It's something that's early 20th century, and we've done that and been there. And but it, unfortunately, it still has its reflections on our interpretations even today. I said unfortunately.
Yes, the same thing is in Croatia. And we also have the Holy Triad, as you said, authority and material, actually. Yeah. Material is, sometimes it seems that in Croatia we have excavations only to have excavations, if you understand what I mean. There is no deeper interpretation. We have tons of material from all around the country, but no one is interpreting it in some kind of a sense of a deeper understanding of some archaeological site,
It can come later, and then theory perhaps even more later. So that's it's important to have material. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we don't have enough time, so I'll.
Yes, I guess it's better to move to the last question. But Stasa, do you want to? Okay.
Well, it's not a question. In fact, it's more a prolonged discussion with my dear colleagues, Predrag and Alexander, and we do have lots of conversations in lots of different situations. I was just reacting to what the two of them were talking about, father figures in smaller communities, academic communities, not only archaeological. It is of course true, but I would just like us to try and escape that kind of parochial thinking that we that belong to smaller archaeological communities, professional communities, are somehow burdened with it more than any other communities. It is also present in any professional community. There is always that kind of a pivotal figure. And let's think about all the ones that we've learned about and read about in our teachings and learnings about archaeological theory and developmental theory. It's not only the case with smaller communities, it is more, how shall I say, more brutal sometimes, but it also exists in all the other academic communities, that there is that single figure that is also the point of gravity where everybody goes for reference. I remember once I was witnessing Colin Renfrew entering the building. And when Colin Renfrew enters the building, it is the same scenario, the same feeling as Dragan Srejović entering the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade. It's Papa's coming. So it's felt, it's materialized. And it also applies to any particular professional community, not only the small ones. I'm just trying, because I understand that that is one of our tasks at this conference, to try and think about our individual and particular experiences in our disciplines, in our countries, in our communities, compared to leading communities. So I just wanted to kind of relax that very strict difference between smaller communities and larger ones that are somehow abolished from leading figures. No, they're not. There is also a pressure of a patriarch even in a large academic community, and there's quite a lot of literature on it in sociology of science, in sociology in general. So that's just a remark, passing remark, which was not short. Sorry, shut up.
Well, I took it, Stasha, that in bigger cultures, the likelihood of having more fathers and more bastards is greater.
Yes. Well, the gene pool is larger. That's true. Yeah.
And if I'm allowed to say something, the Greek case will be perhaps very similar to the Serbian one that Alexander just presented. If we didn't have so many foreign schools and foreign teams working in Greece, I don't know if Yorgos and Dimitris agree with me, but probably will, because we also have our father figures in Greek archaeology. I mean, in the Greek universities, the situation was roughly similar, but the difference between, I'm feeling, between the Serbian case study and the Greek case study is these international teams working in Greece for many years, particularly during, for me, the missing step, the lost step, it was actually, as you presented, Alexander, probably is not before the war, but after the war, the Second World War. Because I think that the real question is not so much because why they didn't follow these early attempts of cultural history archaeology, but why they didn't follow, let's say, processual archaeology in the 60s or at least in the 70s. And to be honest, the lost step, I mean, this phenomenon is, perhaps cannot be explained simply because of the lost step. Why, for example, Serbian archaeologists did not follow in the 70s the processualist school of thinking. This would be also nice, perhaps because of political circumstances. I don't know.
No, not political. It's because of figures, very strong figures who were actually introducing this cultural historical paradigm after with the lost step, for example, Grašin and in Croatia and in Slovenia and in Bosnia, Banat, so on. So they had their say with the lost step, and they were in power at that time, so they wouldn't accept something. Srević didn't want to read Binford. I think he didn't come to his lecture in Belgrade when Binford was in Belgrade. So it was a sheer power of authority that prevented it. And they were in power at that time because of the lost step. That's my thesis.
Perhaps a very last short question by Paulina Florianovic, and then we can move on with the next speaker.
Yes, I just want to, it's extremely interesting. Hello to everyone. I think I'm the only one from Poland here, so a little bit further to the north and coming from a slightly bigger country, but the master-apprentice model is just as good here as everywhere else, as I see. And I've, you know, even studying myself, I have also experienced it. So it's doing quite well. So it's not only small scientific communities. I just want to say that I think it was raised by Jana that in Croatia, and you also said that there's so much studying on the material that there's lack of time for interpretation, not to mention theory. And we experienced exactly the same thing. And me dealing with the political influence on archaeology, or rather how and whether archaeologists in Poland wanted to be involved in politics, shows that whether before the Second World War, they were strongly focused on all kinds of synthetic work, on doing a synthesis. This was their main goal, to try to, you know, get the whole picture in one frame. After the war and during the communist times, they successfully drove away from it and focused on the material analysis in great detail. And my thesis is that it was one of the ways to get away from the political influence on the research. So there were two ways in Poland you could do it. One was just to focus on the material and just avoid all the general conclusions, because you would either had to use the Marxist doctrine or be accused of using any kind of German archaeology influence, which obviously after Second World War was the worst thing that you could do. Or another step was to focus on cultures and civilizations far away from Poland, And that's the success of what we call Mediterranean archaeology in Poland. And actually, it's become much, much more popular than studying the prehistory of our own country. So this is just a comment. I don't want to take too much time from another part of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I apologize. Thank you very much, Alexander, for creating all this stimulating discussion with your paper. I take responsibility for this 15 minutes. And then let's move on with Bojan Dumanov from New Bulgarian University. Bojan is interested in the fields of late antique archaeology, the Great Migration, medieval Bulgaria and Byzantium, and focus mainly on issues of applied arts, ruler ideology, ethnic identity, settlement patterns, and migration. Bojan, please.
Thank you very much. I'm too grateful to attend this conference and to share some of my some parts of my study dedicated to the interaction between archaeology and political action. So I will start with my exposition. The archaeological research and the associated interest to the antiquities in Bulgarian land started to grow immediately after the end of the Russian-Ottoman War and the Congress of Berlin that set the beginning of the modern Bulgarian state. The major background were the works on Balkan antiquities of German, French, British, Italian, Czech, and other historians, archaeologists, ethnographers that have started their investigations since the 17th century. The real inspiration for Bulgarian enthusiasts immediately before and after the liberation came from works of Felix Kanix, published between 1876 and 1879, and also Konstantin Irichek's History of Bulgaria from 1876. As members of Austro-Hungarian scientific institutions, Kanitz and Irichek received some state funding for their investigations and travels, as this has been partly justified by the ever-growing political interests of Habsburg Empire in the Lower Danubian region and South Slavs. The interests of scholars from Imperial Russia also has grown since the middle of the 19th century. In 1844, as professor in University of Kazan, Viktor Grigorovich made a long trip in Bulgarian lands, harvesting valuable Gogolitic manuscripts from some monasteries, thus making them into possession of state archives and private collections. 15 years earlier, the member of Russian Academy, Yuri Venelin, with the permission of Supreme Sovereign Emperor, made a similar but not so successful journey in Bulgaria. Nevertheless, Venelin succeeded to publish his very influential book, Ancient and Modern Bulgarians and Their Political, Ethnographic, Historical and Religious Attitude Towards the Russians. Being a sharp opponent of the mainstream of Scandinavomania in Russia, Venelin insisted on the very deep connections between Russians and Bulgarians through the ages and their common origin ideation past. Actually, he followed the lines in Manifesto of Catherine the Great from 1769 and its appeal to all Christians in Moldova, Vlachia, Montania, Bulgaria, Albania, and other lands to remember the glory of the Slavonic forefathers. The Russian lands were their common fatherland, and through migration and colonization, they have succeeded to found all of the Balkan kingdoms. Most of the educated Bulgarian elite in exile welcomed these theories because they brought to the fore at least the equality of the old Bulgarian civilization to Russian one, and that's to say equal to the great powers. Although their main goal, collecting and harvesting medieval manuscripts, the both Russian scholars contributed to archaeology through their visits and observations at the medieval Bulgarian capital of Trnograd. Venelin and Grigorovich clarified many of the toponyms concerning the historical landscape of the city. They esteemed the ruins on the hills of Trnovo a supreme achievement of the Orthodox civilization. Along with this external interest to the antiquities located in Bulgarian lands, some locally based enthusiasts felt committed with the exploration of antiquities within Bulgarian lands. Among them were the first real Bulgarian nationalists, Georgi Rakovsky and Petko Slovakov. Rakovsky was an acting revolutionary, and even through his illegal activity as leader of a separatist group, he described ancient ruins and collected artifacts. In 1859, Rakovsky published the first guide to collecting and studying antiquities and artifacts, and also started publishing the magazine Bulgarian Antiquity. Nevertheless, being described as New Venelin, Rakovsky did not share the idea of common Slavonic origin so much. As typical representative of the new nationalistic romanticist ideas, he tried to find out the Bulgarian roots into the deep past beyond antiquity and Middle Ages. In contrast, Slovakov was not so active on the battlefield, but on the cultural front. He issued a great number of newspapers and magazines popularizing the old Bulgarian antiquities. Receiving the permission of the local Ottoman mayor, Slovakov was the first Bulgarian who organized excavations at Trnograd. Although being a nationalist, Slovakov was the first one who gave a chance for proclamation of gypsy identity in Bulgaria on the pages of his newspapers. So in the decades preceding the Russian-Ottoman War from 1877 and Berlin Congress, the contributions of Central European and Russian investigators formed two main streams in future Bulgarian archaeology. The first one considered documentation and exploration of antiquities and ancient monuments of every kind and period. The second direction was focused only on the medieval heritage. Naturally, the third original Bulgarian direction, being composed of dilettantes, has fallen into oblivion. Not occasionally, the first Bulgarian Archaeological Society was founded in the city of Trnovo in 1879. However, after the proclamation of Sofia as new capital of the Principality of Bulgaria and the foundation of archaeological societies in Varna and Sofia, this first organization, being composed by local enthusiasts, quickly lost the initiative at the expense of the two major cities. The Scorpio brothers, who migrated to Bulgaria in the 80s of the 19th century, invented the necessary technical and interdisciplinary knowledge into archaeological approach. Actually, with brotherly love, as Professor Florin Curta has recently written, they created the foundations of modern Bulgarian archaeology. In view of the above-mentioned two approaches, the Scorpios combined the Central European holistic interest in antiquities of all kinds and the pan-Slavonic tension towards new discoveries. The political action after the Berlin Congress, which divided the population expressing loyalty to Bulgarian exarchate or Bulgarian identity into three distinct in territorial and political status parts, underpinned the future approaches to the study of ancient Bulgarian heritage. The negative attitude of Russian Empire towards the Union of 1885 and the ensuing war with Serbia contributed to the growing skepticism about Slavonic unity and hence the participation of Slavs into the process of formation of Bulgarian nationhood. Despite all this, In 1899, Karol Skorpil was able to attract the attention of Fyodor Uspensky, director of Russian Imperial Archaeological Institute in Constantinople, thus providing the funding of the first large-scale excavations of the ruins at Aboba Pliska. The Imperial Institute intended to present the site as very representative and important part of the common Slavonic and Orthodox culture and Commonwealth in favor of the Russian political interest on the East Balkans. The discovery of a large pagan temple after the first seasons of work, however, proved the Bulgarian origin of this great medieval center. Although the disappointing results, the Russian Imperial Institute continued funding till the beginning of the Balkan Wars. The excavations of another great medieval center, Preslav, were left to the Bulgarian national honor. The works there have been initiated by Vasil Zlatarsky and the local enthusiast Jordan Gospodinov. Thus, Pliska and later Preslav became the general monuments that demonstrated the originality of Bulgarian medieval culture. During his specialization in Berlin between 1893 and 1895, Zlatarsky was the first Bulgarian historian who came into contact with the German theories of the construction of ethnic identity, being dominated by the ideas of Rudolf Virchow. In the first volume of his History of the Bulgarian State in the Middle Ages, he confirmed the earlier concept of dualism. However, defining its components, he preferred to use people or nation for Bulgars and allied tribe for the Slavs. Concerning the Old Bulgaria or the North Pontic period, Zlatarsky emphasized the heterogeneity of Bulgars. They eventually inherited part of the Hun Empire of Attila, but also were divided into several tribes or hordes living under the domination of one or another of these sub-ethnic groups. In this sense, it's clear that the ethnogenesis of Bulgares, as known from the written sources, started after the middle of the 5th century, but not before 470. Zlatarsky believed that at the time of migration on the lower Danube, the Bulgaric ethnogenesis has been completed at some point, and well-organized ethnic horde arrived on the lower Danube in order to establish a strong monarchical state. Bulgarian rulers initially met some resistance of the Slavic tribal elite, but later they learned how to use this elite against the aristocratic Bulgarian boyar class. The main purpose and effect of this opposition was the creation of a centralized Christian state based on the tradition of Bulgarian kingdom and numerous Slavic tribes. Zlatarsky's student, Peter Mutovchev, also started his career as archaeologist in the medieval department of a newly founded National Archaeological Museum in Sofia. He was a hero of the Balkan and Great Wars, awarded with several Bulgarian and German military honors. The national disaster that followed in 1918, however, brought a considerable deal of pessimism about the merits of the Bulgarian political and hence historical claims. Mutovchev followed the concept of Zlatarsky on Hun origin of Bulgarians. He suggested, however, the existence of earlier confederations between Bulgarian and Slavs and the earlier onset of Bulgaric enclaves on the lower Danube, probably in the late 5th century. This postulate implies a good basis for the subsequent colonization of the eastern part of the Balkan Peninsula by the horde of Khan Asparuh, which according to Mutovchev consisted of no more than 30,000 people. His basic but often underrated and overlooked contribution is the outline of relationship between the influence of environment on the processes of ethnogenesis and national mentality. He paid special attention to the mountains as a factor in the formation and preservation of identity. Surviving the collapse of the national territorial claims, Mutavchev developed the idea that the core of the medieval Bulgarian ethnicity were the Balkan Mountains and the Danube Valley. On the other hand, according to him, the same mountain chain was the main factor in the formation of regional identities and tendencies towards separatism in Middle Ages. Thus emerged one of the most criticized theories of his, namely that in the Middle Ages, the Bulgarian lands have never been geographical entity, and their unity at certain periods has been kept only by the strong monarchic power. The most influential opposition to Zlatarsky's concept were the works of Gancho Cenov, published in the first decades of the 20th century. His works expressed to a large extent the pseudo-nationalistic claims shared by some members of Bulgarian society, pretending the union of the whole of Thrace and Macedonia within the borders of Bulgarian state. Cenov tried to prove the Bulgarian colonization of the Balkans since antiquity or even prehistory. The Bulgarian ethnogenesis ran through the context between the Slavic tribes, Thracians, and Bulgars. According to him, the greatest obstacle to perception of his theory were not its scientific defects, but the backward sense of national honor and patriotism among the Bulgarian elite and the overall influence of the Viennese school on Bulgarian historiography. The quest for the Bulgarian ethnic identity has never acknowledged this model officially. Contrariwise, the Bulgarian national doctrine was based on medieval roots of the Bulgarian state and nation under the influence of Byzantium, thus consciously contrasted with the speculative aging of the conquered Balkan nations. Naturally, archaeology did not ignore the artifacts of prehistory and antiquity, and they early received important place in the cultural heritage and the image of the country. After the First World War, the studies of Bulgarian ethnicity were subjected to strong political influence. With the final collapse of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires that followed the war, the Balkan nations were structured as multi-ethnic formations. The Treaty of Nyoy from 1919 approved the creation of ethnically heterogeneous states, but the ethnic groups within have been institutionalized in very different way. In Europe, ethnic groups were often described as nationalities, and sometimes nations. In the newly created Kingdom of Yugoslavia, nations constituted various provinces of the country. Nationalities were ethnic groups being limited with limited political autonomy, and included Hungarians, Albanians, and Bulgarians. The recognition, however, went through an extremely difficult political way. In the Bulgarian case, the attitude of the Yugoslavian government was ambiguous, as Bulgarian population in Macedonia was nationalized as Macedonians, but the people east of the Morava River were recognized as Bulgarians. On the other hand, the Bulgarian model was completely opposed to the idea that several nations may be united into federation, being dominated by the elite of a single nation. Bulgarians were the only fully institutionalized group against the background of many Turks, Greeks, Gypsies, who are not institutionalized as nations or nationalities, and who also lack the political organization and economic potential inherited to recognized nationalities of Yugoslavia or Romania. Therefore, the national ideology in Bulgaria was an ethnic-based one with a tendency towards rejection of ethnic heterogeneity. After the New Treaty, Bulgarian society developed the idea of Bulgaria bordering on itself. This staging, but to a much greater extent, the political and economic isolation in which Bulgaria has fallen after the end of the Great War, provoked the orientations toward cultural alliance with countries that shared a similar fate as Hungary and Germany. In order to explain the origin of early medieval Bulgarian culture, Bogdan Filov, Geza Feher, and Andrei Protic followed the migrationist approach. In 1924, Filov published his Old Bulgarian Art. In this book, he emphasized the Eastern elements in architecture and art, looking for their origins in Central Asia and Persia. Filov generally acknowledged the paramount importance of Eastern influences coming from Iran, Anatolia, Syria, or the steppes in the art of the Thracian, Roman, and medieval periods. In his studies of medieval culture, he denied the influence or connection with antiquity or Byzantium. In this sense, the general impression was that the direction of Filov's research was running parallel to the main political doctrine of cultural distinction of Bulgaria from its main political competitors, and especially Yugoslavia and Greece. In 1932, however, Bogdan Filov softened some of his views, highly lightening several Greco-Roman traditions that formed part of the formation of Bulgarian medieval art after the 7th century. Nevertheless, Filov's membership in centers of Slavonic studies, he did not attach any significant importance to the Slavic element. The only one who criticized him in this aspect was Christo Miyatev in 1935. Bogdan Filov clearly outlined the original Bulgarian features in architecture and ornamental arts, but also acknowledged that this old Bulgarian tradition was helpless before the early Christian relics, the Byzantine influence after the Christianization, and the action of liquidating a significant power of the conservative boyar class. Entering the 30s of the 19th century, the circle around Filov has accepted the historian view of triple structure of the medieval Bulgarian ethnicity, but at the same time declared that neither the Slavs nor the Thracians could be identified through archaeological methods. As participants in political and social life, Filov and other archaeologists tried to present the cultural heritage of the Bulgarian lands to the European specific scientific and general public. In their academic research, it's difficult to establish a sharpened concept of the Great Bulgarian or some ancient form of Bulgarentum, which would surpass and even would prove to be the ultimate winner of an ephemeral duel with the Roman or Byzantine tradition. At the same time, in Germany, Hermann Schneider declared that 1933 marked the ultimate victory in the study of German culture and gave the German element an unthinkable earlier meaning. What we define as German must be discovered in its purest form in the most ancient historical periods. Bogdan Filov, in a study called Monuments of Thracian Art, that's nowadays considered as a fundamental for archaeology, argued that the relations between certain local Thracian style, which had not ethnic or national character, and medieval artifacts would have been just within the framework of Khmer ornamental trends. This trend, however, in no world could be called original tradition, one, but was a result of intensive contacts with Iranian-speaking ethnicities of the North Baltic Steppe and the Caucasus. 4 years after the coup of the 9th of September 1944, the Committee of Science, Art and Culture has already created the basic concepts of transformation of Bulgarian archaeology. The conceptual and institutionally based Stalinism emerged, and the time of the bulletproof, official, dialectically based argumentation has come. The beginning of the complete distinction to the concepts of the pre-war Bulgarian archaeology has been initiated through special resolution after discussion of the state of affairs and purposes of archaeology and museology in 1948. Decisive impetus along these lines, the selection of new staff and the reformation of the old ones, was made in 1950 at the first scientific meeting of the Institute of Archaeology, chaired by the newly fledged academician, ex-terrorist and ex-regent, Todor Pavlov. The chairman outlined the background of the transformation of archaeology. According to him, the archaeology from science for the people should be converted into science of the people or people's science. At the meeting, Christo Miatev presented an extensive paper called State of Affairs of the Bulgarian Archaeology in 1948, and he clearly gave priority to the study of the Slavic and the Slavonic Bulgaric sites, and also to the material culture of the late antiquity till the Bulgarian arrival, in order, one, to outline the cultural heritage that the Slavs and the Bulgars have acquired, preserved, and transformed. According to the technique of argumentation, specific phenomena will be removed from the specialized field in which they have usually been discussed and fit directly into the universal history of mankind. They became subject to another universal and specific laws, as the universal laws in their turn were set by the fundamental works of Marxism and Leninism. The history of the material culture of the present Bulgarian population, since most ancient times till the middle of the 19th century, should be written on the basis of the approach to dialectical materialism. Professor Dimitar Dimitrov, another one of the reformed scholars from the pre-war generation, stated that the approach to dialectical materialism should reach its highest application when archaeology breaks off its apolitical background, thus penetrating into political life of the masses. Archaeologists had to private and understand the Kunstwollen of the working class, thus extracting the necessary approach from the farmers and the stockmen who has already purified themselves from bourgeois conceptions. The younger and well-bred archaeologists warmly embraced the idea, rejecting the pan-Bulgarian chauvinism. They anonymously withstood the ethnic roots of the medieval society while turning their attention to the Marxist class societies. The meaningless reiteration of phrases, often being copied from the protocols of the working cooperatives and agrarian union assemblies, indicates some important feature. The ideologically insulted trauma was so strong that almost has led to scientific death or scientific coma-like state for many of the pre-war scholars. The leading archaeologists leveled severe criticism and self-criticism that clearly demonstrated another fact of interest. They were not familiar with the real trends of the Marxist archaeology, basing their arguments on formulations dating back to the early 30 years. As a teacher from the small town of Dupnica, Atanas Milchev corresponded exactly to the Dimitrov's model of class-conscious young scholar of good origin for the new image of the Bulgarian archaeology. In 1946, Milchev continued his education as PhD student in Leningrad, and after the promotion, he returned to Bulgaria. Thus, he proved to be the only scholar who was aware of the theoretical formulations of Soviet archaeology. Significantly, he was appointed as author of the theoretical Marxist-Leninist part of the first volume of History of Bulgaria in 1954, and its revised edition from 1961, as well as the first 5 chapters of the Christomati of Soviet Union history. During the 50s, Alexander Milchev presented the idea that in the Middle Ages, Thracians have lost their identity and did not exist as ethnicity. The Thracians, however, besides the Scythians and Sarmatians, generally attended in the ethnogenesis of the Eastern Slavs, as the process also included Russians. Within the process, Thracians hold the position of a population of war material culture, being simultaneously at class war on several fronts, against their own aristocracy, the nomad chieftains, the rich Hellenistic North Pontic cities, as well as the Roman Empire and later Byzantium. Despite the fact Milchev has risen as a specialist in pro-Roman archaeology, he enthusiastically started working on the problem of the Bulgarian ethnogenesis. Later, in his first general studies concerning the early Slavs and Bulgars, Atanas Milchev noted with sarcastically satisfaction that the main factor in the shift of the older scholars' interest toward the Slavic studies has been the revolution of the 9th of September, thus denying their sincerity in widely declared intentions. So he became the first acknowledged specialist in the topic, being equipped with the Stalinist concept of the Slavic antiquity that, despite the political changes in Soviet Union, has remained the same till the 90s of the last century. Milchev also enjoyed the approval favor of Todor Pavlov, as the latter became a member of the political bureau of Bulgarian Communist Party in 1966. Milchev denied the classical concept of Bulgarian dominant ethnicity and introduced the idea about the Slavic colonization, which completely changed the ethnic and cultural patterns in Balkan Peninsula. However, it has been obvious that any treatment, either ideological or based on historical information about the Slavic domination in medieval Bulgaria, would not be supported by the archaeological data. The turn towards the late antique monuments, which were contemporary to the early stage of colonization, was also of little matter. The idea to accept some kind of continuity between the late antiquity and the Middle Ages should break the class revolutionary beginning. On account of this reason, Milchev resorted to the reliable Soviet approach to the ethnogenesis, the addition of more ancient and more evident ethnos in relation to archaeology. Naturally, only the Thracians could be this kind of ethnic formation on the East Balkans. A good background for this assumption provided the already forged historical concept of the Trinity into the formation of Bulgarian nationality. However, this idea needed the necessity of applying to the archaeological context, and then to deal with 2 obstacles. The brilliance of the ancient.
Bojan, can I ask you to speed up a little bit? I mean, if you can, because you have exceeded the time, 25 minutes.
Yeah, of course,
so
of course. I will.
But the best you can. It's okay. You don't have to stop now, by no means.
All right, I will go to the to the conclusion. I will go on the conclusion. Actually, I outlined the basic position of the generation of the 50s and the 60s of the last century. So actually these actions provided the development of some kind of ideological trap. So the problem of Thracian element in Bulgarian nationality is a wonderful example of template construction of a fiction in science designed to serve the different needs of the communist regime, from political, ideological at state level to simply daily ones. The extremely important but fragile stratum of the national identity became a victim of rational selfishness. The humanitarians engaged with the articulation of the fiction used the template of the class and party language, which became the skeleton of the idea. Similarly to many other cases, one also faces the mirror science, as in order certain approach or method to be approved, a series of templates have been copied or overexposed, thus creating a superficial idea of authenticity, which quickly took root among the general public space. The problem of the cultural heritage was removed from the debates and the consensus of the responsible professionals, being shifted to the much broader field of the redistribution of the world symbolic capital and inside the dialectic course of world history. The decisive meaning had the arguments of the Marxists, but not the specialists. The ideologically correct model of Atanas Milchev was taken away beyond the archaeological discussion, attached to the entire public dogma, and has hardly redounded to the advantage of the transformation of the ancient Thracian antiquity into ancient Bulgarian one. A kind of special blocking the thought exhaustivist rhetoric has been created, as the verbal formulation as well as the way of their arrangement seemed inevitable and invisible, like sacred magic spells. The outsiders who tried to follow the rhetoric hardly understood it, as their attempts usually produced nonsense. Non-archaeologists attended yet inside the circle of influential persons around the ruling communist upper crust. The meaning of the archaeologists have been seen as workers hired for excavations, as the interpretation of the artifacts was entrusted to the other factors. As a consequence of this construction that was based on the historical fiction, nowadays two parallel running concepts exist. One, a scientific one, being grounded on the subjective historic and archaeological sources, but not very popular, and another, widespread public notions expecting the archaeological science to discover and explain the truth about the most ancient antiquity of Bulgarian ethnicity and nation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bojan. We don't have much time. I mean, Bojan exceeded the time, but I think we have some time at least for some questions, and I see the first hands rising up. So Monica, do you want to ask something, please?
Yeah, I will be quick. So thank you for this elaborate presentation. I would like to ask you about the role of physical anthropology in construction of ethnogenesis in archaeological interpretations before Second World War, after, and in present day Bulgarian archaeology.
Yeah, so physical anthropology had a great role in this aspect, but concerning the medieval period, there was not enough material for investigations before the 50s of the 20th century. The first B-ritual Bulgarian medieval cemeteries were discovered and excavated after the middle of the 50s. So the growing of the anthropological approach started since this years. And what the anthropologist concluded is this, that the medieval Bulgarians were not Mongoloids, as one previously believed. And also there was the same process of brachycivilization also has been as even in Bulgarian case, this process ran slower than the other cemeteries in the neighboring states. Another interesting question concerns the blood investigations, the investigations of the blood ties, and that proposed the future development of DNA studies, because they started immediately after the end of the First World War. And one expected that the archaeologists will enter into this discussion, because this discussion concerned the racial studies. But the Bulgarian archaeologists, even the prehistorians, remained neutral in this discussion about the racial studies. So the role of the physical anthropology nowadays is still very, very great. But this was the main obstacle, the lack of material before the end of the Second World War.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's move on with Dimitris.
Thank you, Yanni. Thank you, Boyan, for this great exploration. I really enjoyed it, like the previous one on the Serbian paradigm. And as Yanni said just now, before, they read extremely close to the Greek paradigm in the late 19th and up to at least the middle of the 20th century. And now we know that archaeology plays a pivotal role in the creation of a nation, of national history. In Greece, we have called this the Hellenization of Greece. And this has caused us some problems in the past, in the press and elsewhere. But in the Greek story, we have a parallel development between archaeology, which sort of was developed specifically for that. It was used in Greek university specifically as an ethnogenetical tool, on the one hand, and because, of course, Greece was invented by Germans, folk studies on the other. So you had a parallel development between folk studies and archaeology. So my question is, do you have folk studies in Bulgaria at the same time, and also Serbia? If we can open this discussion, have you noticed, have you observed, have you studied the parallel development of these two disciplines?
Yes, there were folk studies, and the Bulgarian ethnographers actually deal with this. The Bulgarian archaeologists were too engaged in the field work and processing the materials, and the situation is the same nowadays, actually. So there was not very nice and close interaction between archaeology and ethnography. Not occasionally, I underlined the person of Peter Mutovchev, because Peter Mutovchev, the historian and archaeologist that I mentioned in my exposition, Peter Mutovchev was the first and probably the only archaeologist who paid attention to folk studies, to the mentality of the peasant population and the regional identities. Probably he was the only archaeologist who paid any attention on racial studies or the race as factor in the formation of nationhood or national mentality. And yes, he was very contributive in his studies over the environment in Bulgaria. And actually, he introduced this growing pessimism about the Bulgarian Union, about the unity of the Bulgarian nation, because of the heterogeneity of the local Bulgarian landscapes.
Dimitri, are you okay? I guess. So let's move on to Predrag.
I just want to ask a short question about this rather ambivalent status of Marxism after the Second World War, of course, when Bulgaria came under the Russian Soviet control. Marxism appeared, of course, in various forms. Well, from, let's say, very dogmatic ideological instrumentalization to, let's say, genuine epistemological attempts. I got this impression that, well, it's very ambivalent, actually, in Bulgarian case. In the end, you said that the interpreters were Marxists, but archaeologists were those who were providing materials. So I must say for Yugoslavia that Yugoslavia was perfect case to have a Marxist archaeology because it was multi-ethnic. So the national perspective was not really desired. Actually, against this kind of perspective, the Communist Party proposed doctrine of brotherhood and unity of Yugoslav nations, which basically meant balancing between different ideas how to develop nations and, let's say, to promote solidarity and so on. So Marxism would be perfect because it's, let's say, contains a lot of internationalism in it, not so much nationalism as, let's say, it's obvious from your presentation that national perspective still dominated the study of history of Bulgarians. So my question is, were there any levels of Marxism, let's say, more clearly defined? I used to use the term protocolar Marxism, where actually you should just say a few void phrases just in order to start the introduction into something, and then you go on with, let's say, culture, historical, whatever analysis and so on. And this protocolar Marxism were normally present at some anniversaries and some sort of, let's say, genre of celebration of achievements, but not in real epistemology.
Yes, of course, the protocol Marxism existed. Its use was very important and necessary to publish a book, to publish an article. But actually, everything in Bulgaria, including the development of the political, the economical, and social life, after the end of the war, actually everything followed the Soviet model, but a Soviet model that was an old one already, old-fashioned. That's to say, what the Soviet Union did in the 30s, in the beginning of the 30s, the 30s of the 20th century, had to be applied in Bulgaria after the war. And our Marxists actually lost the actual development of the Marxist ideas after the war, or immediately before it, because Todorpalov, Tanas Milchev, and other philosophers actually used the Mar conception, the conception of Marism, and the ideas about the ethnogenesis of Semyon Derzhavin. And these ideas, however, were rejected in Soviet Union immediately just before the war. So that's why the 50s of the 20th century have been marked by this old-fashioned conception of Marxism concerning the social class and social societies presented like social groups, not ethnic ones. And yes, this rhetoric actually started to disappear with the middle of the 60s or with the late 60s of the 20th century. But actually the Marxist components remain like protocol Marxism in the writings, in the publications. I'm sure, and I'm afraid that actually many of the Bulgarian archaeologists and historians did not have never understood, have never understood the Marxist ideology in reality.
Predrag, are you okay? Do you want to add something or?
No. Thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to the last question for the session by Alexander, please.
Just a short comment. I took a lot of your time today, so I'm not going to take more. Just one small comment. I thank Bojan for his very interesting paper and a lecture that opened so much questions. Just think about Russian Archaeological Institute and Uspensky. He mentioned, I think it's important, and if he is interested in that, in National Museum in Belgrade, there are a few Vasic documents and minutes from conferences with Uspensky and Russian Archaeological Institute in Constantinople in 1911, before the First World War. So I think it might be interesting. That's it. I don't want to pursue this anymore and to take your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions.
I think we can start with the last presentation of this today's session from Georgios Granakis, who is teaching the National Capodistria University of Athens. He's doing his teaching and his research is on theoretical archaeology at our university, our department, and the title of his talk is Old Dogs and New Tricks, Paradigmatic Continuity, again continuity, but also change in Aegean prehistoric archaeology. Georgios, please.
Thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay. In my turn, I would like to thank, like the previous speakers, the organizers for making this happen, despite all the problems of the pandemic. And it has been a really, the day has given us a lot of food for thought, and I think we're all thankful for that. Now, as you see, I'm going to talk about Aegean prehistory, which was established as a distinct field of archaeological research in the late 19th and the early 20th century. It has ever since been quick to receive the latest paradigmatic developments of the archaeological discipline. At the same time, as I will argue, it features a long-standing tradition of paradigmatic conservatism. As a result, the current state of Aegean research may be characterized as traditional plus, namely an empiricist version of processualism with occasional overtones from other paradigms. My presentation has a dual aim. On the one hand, it attempts a genealogy of the paradigmatic evolution of Aegean prehistory, according to its main milestones: evolutionism, culture history, new archaeology or processual archaeology, post-processual archaeology, and post-humanist approaches. On the other hand, it argues that this evolution is related to several parameters, such as the complexity of the archaeological record, the academic orientation of many of the so-called foreign schools of archaeology, and the place of archaeology within Greek national identity. Now, the official starting point of Aegean prehistory is Schliemann's excavations at Hisarlik in modern Turkey in 1870, and then in the citadel of Mycenae in Greece in 1876. Schliemann had a seminal contribution despite his notoriously bold methodology, if he had any methodology at all. When other scholars of the time underlined the mismatch between the description of Troy in the Homeric texts and the topography of Hisarlik, Schliemann placed more emphasis on the archaeological finds than the texts. This is what transferred the Aegean prehistory from armchair archaeology into the archaeology of the spade. Schliemann had other important contributions too. He insisted on the use of archaeological photography for the accurate illustration of finds. He collaborated with Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Adolf Furtwängler, who studied the architecture and the pottery respectively, and each one of them deserves a special mention here. Dörpfeld was an architect who became a prehistoric and classical archaeologist. He was in favor of the meticulous and disciplined excavation, documentation, study, and reconstruction of ancient monuments. He adopted and perfected the then novel technique of digging in spits, namely removing the soil of the fill in thin layers of 5, 10, or 20 centimeters, depending on the context. He also advocated that the combination of the soil sequence, the architectural sequence, and the artifact typological sequence may provide an accurate picture of cultural and historical evolution. These advances were further supported by Adolf Furtwängler, an early evolutionist who rejected the romantic approach to archaeology as a history of ancient fine art that had been introduced by Joachim Winkelmann in the 18th century and had become the orthodoxy ever since. Furtwängler firmly believed that all artifacts, especially minor finds, which were actually the ones that he studied a lot, should be examined in detail and put in order according to their morphological development. Dörpfeld's and Furtwängler's advances paved the way for a then novel empirical approach to past material remains. Unfortunately, they both set a couple of drawbacks for Aegean prehistoric research, either willingly or unwillingly. Dörpfeld became lured by Schliemann's fascination with Homeric texts and established Homeric archaeology, a type of research that still finds proponents. Both Dörpfeld and Furtwängler, similarly to many German scholars of the time, saw prehistory as a stage of human evolution that was organically linked to antiquity, rather than as a cultural phenomenon of its own. This view strengthened the link between prehistoric and classical archaeological methodologies and hindered the independent development of Aegean prehistory. More paradigmatic advances took place in the first half of the 20th century. And actually 2 years before its beginning in 1898, Christos Tsoundas, a Greek archaeologist and for many the actual father of prehistoric archaeology in Greece, coined the term Cycladic civilization because his finds from Bronze Age cemeteries could not be typologically linked to any of the known cultures of the time. This is one of the first examples of the culture historical approach that characterized the traditional paradigm of archaeology in the first half of the 20th century. Despite this progressive for the time approach, Tsoundas maintained his link to German scholarship and combined evolutionism with the Altertumswissenschaft, the combined textual and artifactual research about the classical past. He thus defined the Neolithic finds as the terminus post quem of Greek prehistory. He identified the first inhabitants of Greece with the Pelasgians of the ancient texts and argued that they had mixed with the Danaan immigrants from the north and together created the uniform Mycenaean culture of Greece. Around that time, there was one more hesitant step towards culture historical archaeology with Sir Arthur Evans and his excavations at Knossos, which were published in his multi-volume work, The Palace of Minos. Minos was identified by Evans as an office title, contrary to the ancient text that considered him an actual figure. Furthermore, the subtitle of Evans's work, A Comparative Account of the Successive Stages of the Early Cretan Civilization, demonstrates his clear Darwinist affiliations and his commitment to see the Minoan culture as an evolving organism. A few years after the start of Evans's excavations, Alan Weiss did ethnoarchaeological research in Thessaly together with Maurice Thompson. Weiss became then director of the British School at Athens early in the 1920s, and even proposed to set up an environmental and an archaeometry lab. Nevertheless, he and his friend and American colleague, Karl Blegen, maintained their ties to the German Altertumswissenschaft and Homeric archaeology, and remain within the strictly empiricist framework of traditional archaeology. In their correspondence, they dubbed Gordon Child's early work as typically childish, a characterization which demonstrates the distance between the actual cultural historical paradigm and its Greek version at the time. After World War II, archaeology began to question the traditional paradigm, and Greece was one of the first places where this happened. In the early 1950s, more than a decade before the formal appearance of new archaeology, the American archaeologist William MacDonald led the University of Minnesota Messina Expedition, or UME as it became known, which set out to explore the diachronic changes in land use as part of human adaptation to the natural environment. UME thus foregrounded new archaeology. The latter was formally introduced to Greece in 1972, only a few years after its appearance by one of its main proponents, the Pope, as he was called today, Colin Renfrew, and his influential book titled The Emergence of Civilization. Renfrew introduced the main components of processual research, such as systems theory and quantitative analysis. Nevertheless, he was cautious enough to maintain a close, albeit critical link to traditional archaeology. Thus, the whole first half of the book is devoted to the review of cultural sequence in the Cyclades during the early Bronze Age. One may also add here how Renfrew cooperated with Maria Gimbutas at the excavation of Sitagri. Unfortunately, Aegean prehistoric research took a decade to embrace processual archaeology. Renfrew's rejection of a unilinear pattern of culture historical evolution was heavily criticized. Intensive survey, a by and large processual type of field research, became popular in the 1980s and 1990s. Many conservative archaeologists accepted processual methods, such as environmental archaeology, archaeometry, and quantitative analysis, as long as their own field of expertise, typological classification, and relative dating, remained intact. They kept a distance from processual explanatory model building and preferred to remain within the confines of their own empiricist interpretive framework. Post-processual archaeology has had a sporadic effect on Aegean prehistoric research. It was adopted by a handful of researchers only, who promoted the importance of corporeal experience of material culture as a parameter that affected past social discourse. The social importance of food and drink and of gender divisions have been a couple of the most popular interpretive tendencies. Others include the perception of the landscape and the importance of collective values over past economic organization. The currently trending post-humanist approaches have had a similarly restricted effect, despite the fact that several of their proponents, such as Christopher Whitmore and Carl Knappett, are actually Aegeanists. the introduction of symmetrical archaeology, actor network theory, materiality and agency studies or assemblage theory has been of limited effect so far. Overall, Aegean prehistoric research has retained strong links with the traditional paradigm. It is still considered the primary research duty to conduct fieldwork and publish final reports that focus on the meticulous description, typological classification, and relative dating of the finds. Reports often include analytical chapters, of course, and interpretive conclusions. However, the emphasis is always on empirical data description, while interpretation largely conforms to the processual canon that past social structures may be deciphered from material remains in a rather straightforward and faithful manner. In the remainder of this paper, I would like to explore the possible reasons behind this paradigmatic back and forth of Aegean prehistoric research. One, and the main reason, is the complexity of the Aegean prehistoric archaeological record. And one example is multi-period sites, and such as the one that you see here. This is Plassi, that is excavated by Yannis Papadatos and me at Marathon outside Athens, and it's the official excavation site of the Department of History and Archaeology of our university. As you can see, the remains at Plassi range from the early Helladic down to the late Roman period. Such continuity of inhabitation makes the link between prehistoric and classical archaeology much more understandable. Site formation processes are often complex too. For example, the earthworks that reshaped the hill of Knossos time and again before and when the palace was built during the early and the Middle Bronze Age erased part of the earlier remains of habitation on the hill. On the east side of the palace, Evans found the so-called Grand Staircase intact, and the Grand Staircase is 3 stories high. So the excavation had to tackle all these practical challenges. The high demands of most Aegean excavations combine with the current meticulous field methodologies into very large interdisciplinary projects. We take at least 1 decade in the field and another decade before they're able to start publishing their final reports. Renfrew's Keros project is actually one of the exceptions to the general rule, with 4 volumes of publication already. However, as you can see, it did take them 12 years of field work in between, as like many other field projects. Aegean prehistoric research is also a product of the local filtering of theoretical and methodological developments of the archaeological discipline, entailing a strong German influence. Before World War II, the German archaeological curriculum was the role model for the British school at Athens. This may in a way explain why Alan Weiss was reluctant to see the potential in Child's research. Moreover, Wilhelm Dörpfeld was a very influential personality at the time. Evans rushed to reconstitute the theatral area of the palace at Knossos because he received news of Dörpfeld's imminent visit to Crete. When it comes to the British School at Athens, one should always keep in mind that there was also a difference between its members. Oxonians were more friendly affiliated to classics and thus to German scholarship than Cantabrigians, who tended to see archaeology as a social discipline since the end of the 19th century. Post-war British research was dominated by Sinclair Hood, who set out to introduce the Wheeler Canyon system of excavation in Greece, but otherwise remained empiricist. After all, Sir Arthur Evans's interpretive vision of Minoan Crete required a long period of research digestion. It is no wonder then that only Renfrew was able to put forward an alternative paradigmatic framework for the prehistoric Aegean, while the deconstruction of Evans's views commenced in the 1980s, after Sinclair Hood had concluded his survey of the Knossos area and the fresh architectural mapping of the palace. The rest of the foreign schools were less keen to adopt innovative approaches than the British. For example, the École Française d'Athènes, or EFA as it is known, the French school, retained a strong classicist focus. As the only French research institution accepting students, the so-called Athenians or les Athéniens, until the events of May 1968 and the subsequent foundation of the CNRS in France. This classicist orientation becomes evident when considering that the final report on the site of Kira was postponed until after World War II, although the site is next to Delphi, one of the main French excavations. Fieldwork in Macedonia by the Armée de l'Orient, the French Eastern Army, and Renaudin during and after the Great War was only resumed in the early 60s. The American School of Classical Studies at Athens also held German classicism as an academic role model at the beginning of the 20th century. Tellingly, Hetty Goldman excavated prehistoric estuaries as a compensation for losing her project at ancient Colophon in Asia Minor after the Turkish army crushed the Greek forces in 1922 at the aftermath of the Great War. Karl Blegen is the main exception to the American classicist focus, with his excavations in Corinthia and also at Troy and after the war at Pylos, the so-called Palace of Nestor. However, as the name of the site implies, he was an empiricist archaeologist influenced by Homeric archaeology. His student and successor, John Caskey, was also a traditional archaeologist, but open-minded enough to entrust his excavation projects to the younger generation of American archaeologists in the 60s and 1970s. Most of them became influenced by new or processual archaeology and spearheaded the paradigmatic shift in Greece during the 1980s and 1990s. Since the 1990s, Aegean prehistoric research has been marked by the establishment and operation of the Institute of Aegean Prehistory, a non-profit organization that supports prehistoric projects. INSTAP has a study center based in East Crete as well, home of important American field projects in the area. Aegean research has benefited immensely by INSTAP, and it owes an unpayable debt to this institution. It should be noted, however, that INSTAP has prioritized field projects and final site reports, which has implicitly and probably unwillingly encouraged the empirical part of archaeological research. Let us come to Greek archaeologists. Greek archaeologists shared this attitude of their foreign colleagues, that they found it be difficult to break away from a well and long entrenched empiricism. Tsuntas and two of his students, Georgios Milonas, excavator of Mycenae, and Spiridon Marinatos, excavator of Akrotiri in Thera, dominated Greek prehistoric research until the 1980s and maintained an ethnocentric traditional narrative about the unbroken historical continuity of Hellenism, or otherwise Greekness, from the Neolithic to the end of the Bronze Age and on to Greek antiquity. The long-standing close affiliation of Greek academics to German scholarship strengthened this persistence until the 1980s, with a few exceptions, such as Dimitrios Theocharis's interest in environmental archaeology in the 1960s, or Georgios Hourmouziadis' Marxist approach to archaeology from the 1970s onwards. Otherwise, Greek archaeological thought and practice evolved in a very conservative manner towards a traditional paradigmatic framework enriched with concepts and methods from other paradigms. This slow tempo of change is related to the fundamental role of antiquities in Greek identity. Since the rise of Greek nationalism in the late 18th century, the revolution against the Ottoman Empire in 1821, and the subsequent formation of the independent Greek state in 1830. As ancient Greek culture lay in the foundations of modern Western civilization, antiquities were considered the passport of Greece back to Europe and away from its Oriental past. The national role of antiquities was maintained through a modern Greek history and various events. There was the irredentism until the 1920s. The 1930s generation, a literary and arts movement that promoted the vision of Hellenism or Greekness. The right-wing governments that secured the emplacement of Greece in the Western Bloc in the 1950s and the Cold War period, or the military coup d'etat of the 1960s and early 70s. Later on, there was the ideology of a brotherless nation, which prevailed in the 80s, together with the first socialist government of Greece. And of course, one should not forget the nationalist rise with the Macedonia issue in the late 1990s. And of course, the feeling of national pride that accompanied the Olympic Games in 2004. During this long period of about 2 centuries, the so-called Archaeological Service, a government agency solely responsible for the curation of antiquities, has adopted an authorized discourse on archaeological heritage. This discourse places emphasis on monumentality and ethnocentrism. Furthermore, and as international research has always retained an upper hand in the archaeology of Greece, Greek archaeologists have instead promoted a possessive attitude to antiquities in the name of the state and the Greek public. This attitude could only be facilitated by an authoritative formalist and traditional archaeological paradigm. The grand-scale development projects of the last 30 years have further focused interest on the excavation, documentation, preservation, and storage of antiquities in expense of synthesis and theoretical reflection. Empirical work has again been foregrounded. I have argued that practical, academic, and politico-ideological reasons have prevented Aegean prehistoric research from fully embracing almost all paradigmatic shifts in archaeology since the 19th century. I'm not condemning empiricism necessarily, or rather I would say that the issue here is to disentangle empirical work from empiricism. And this is the real challenge that we're facing. And of course, possible solutions are as complex as the current state of Aegean archaeology and thus beyond the scope of the present paper. However, I would like to just indicatively suggest that the crux of the matter, as I said, is to retain empirical work and eschew empiricist attitudes. An idea would be to make all field documentation an open access and common good. Another possible research strand, almost equally obvious, is to strengthen our research ties with our neighboring fields, so as to open up discussion on the theory, method, and practice of archaeology in the Aegean and beyond. After all, it has been this local filtering of paradigmatic changes which has kept Aegean research behind. Interestingly, this means a refreshed relation with both Balkan and classical archaeology. And both these areas bear the influence of continental tradition too. The right way then may be for old dogs to try new tricks as they already have been trying. Thank you.
Yorgo, thank you very much for keeping time and for this comprehensive presentation of the Greek case study, which allows me to shorten a little bit my tomorrow's presentation. Thank you very much for this. Let's move on with the discussion. We have plenty of time actually, because we are on time. So I'm waiting for some hands to raise up. No. Everything was clear, also different from the rest of the Balkan case studies. Dimitri, please. Dimitri? Yeah.
So thank you, Yorgo. This was very, very nice, very informative, and quite refreshing. So are we allowed to assume that in Greece, especially in the late 19th century, instead of the historians running after the archaeologists, it was the archaeologists who were running after the historians. They sort of introduced in archaeology models they borrowed from historians like Paparigopoulos, who taught national continuity and all that.
Well, you have probably heard it yourself because when we're all students, the usual saying was that archaeology is a servant to history. Archaeologists find and historians talk and write. Thank God this has changed. But I do think that Tsundas especially was in a way trying to follow up Paparigopoulos. Paparigopoulos had introduced this idea of Greek historical continuity, and I think Tsundas was trying to push it further back into time. And this is why the classicist tradition was had been helping him, because there were the Homeric texts which presented a link between a classical past when they had been recorded and a pre-classical past. So he was able to, and actually it's in his Mycenaean, or in his book on Mycenaean Greece, he argued that instead of legends, now we have objects, we have objective truth showing this continuity. So yes, and I think it all this chimed very well with the nationalist atmosphere of the time.
And of course, Tsundas and Paparigopoulos were contemporaries in our department, right? In our school, anyway. Weren't they professors together?
I think wasn't Tsundas a bit later than Paparigopoulos?
Yeah, he was younger, but still, they must have overlapped at some point.
Yes.
But Georgos, if I may interject here, do you mean to say that at the present time, the Paparigopoulos scheme has been somewhat undermined? Seriously, is it, I mean, I'm not talking here of some isolated subversive voices, but in terms of the canon of Greek history, isn't the Paparigopoulos scheme still very much still in place?
Well, depending where you're looking. I mean, there's 3 professors at the University of Athens here, and none of us teach that there's a seamless continuity from time immemorial to the present day. We don't. I mean, Tsundas was talking about the Hellenic spirit of Mycenaean culture half a century or even more before the decipherment of Linear B. So he sort of imagined the Mycenaeans were sort of Greek speaking or Greek thinking. But I don't think you'll find Paparigopoulos as a doctrine in Greek university. You will find it in schools, of course, and in your everyday life and Facebook.
I would also say that this idea of unbroken continuity is implicitly accepted by the public and explicitly by a part of the public. It certainly lurks within academia. Okay, but I think if you ask most, well, I'm sure that all archaeologists will tell you that the Tsundas version of this narrative is not accepted anymore, and I'm sure most historians will be critical about it. Now, whether they will eschew it, they will reject it entirely or not is a different issue. But I think everybody has grown more critical and about this this doctrine. And I know that archaeologists do not follow it at all. I cannot really speak about historians because it's a completely different field.
Yeah.
If I may add something here. Yorgos mentioned this in his paper. There was a crucial time in Greek intellectual history in the interwar years when the intellectual elite of the time created the concept of Hellenicity, of Greekness. And this following trends elsewhere, like in Italy, Spain, even in India, whatever. This is a modernist tendency to identify, but this was always on aesthetic grounds. And even Paparigopoulos was clever enough to speak of continuity of culture, of spirit, yes. But not of blood.
Of race, yeah, not of
yes.
race.
And the first time Greeks were talking about continuity of race was in the 1990s, with the rise of the far right, after the sort of there's the so-called Macedonian crisis. Up to then, I think, yes, and as Yorgos said, there was an implicit acceptance of an aesthetic, a cultural continuity because of the landscape and art and aesthetics, and Homer being our sort of intellectual genealogy of us all. But as far as that, no one really argued that we were the same blood with these people.
But cultural continuity still holds, right? As a as an overall notion, yeah, yeah.
But sometimes as a retrospective explanation, because you find it in our 20th century poetry. It seems that it's still valid. It doesn't mean that it's unbroken. It's a clever argument.
Stasa, do you want to make a point or ask something?
I was just, while listening to Yorgos, I was just thinking about some things that I've read and pondered upon in my work concerning these particular questions. And it is a good opportunity for me to ask 3 Greek Athenian professors what they think about it. About Mark Hertzfeld's ideas about that identity struggle between the Byzantine component and the classical component in the modern Greek identity. It was written about by Yanis Kamilakis, by Elena Yalouri. That's where I acquainted that idea. So what's your stance on it? That the whole story, the whole 19th century identity building in Greece, modern Greek state, was somehow imbalanced or in the constant clash between these 2 very mighty traditions, Byzantine at the one hand, and on the other hand, the classical one. And how it echoed, in your view, how it echoed in archaeology, especially in Aegean and classical archaeology.
Yorgos, do you want to say something, and then to Dimitri?
Yes. Well, I certainly agree that the classicist tradition was imported by European scholarship, and this was further eased because of the Bavarian administration of Greece in the 1830s. So we had the Germans in Greece, and they imported the classicist tradition. And the first attempts to do prehistoric research were aiming to push the Greek past further back into time. So prehistory was prehistory, a stage before history. So this is how it all started. Yes, as an imported feature, it did clash with the local tradition, which was, I'm not sure how I would call it Byzantine, I would call it Ottoman, because Greece had just exited the Ottoman Empire. So it was the local version of the Ottoman way of living, the Ottoman way of life. Yes, many Greeks were more, how can I put it, conscious about where they came from, but about their origins, and they studied ancient Greek texts. But the overall population was well, ignorant of all this. So yes, it was important. There was a clash. It was a kind. It was seen as an attempt to change ways of life. When the Byzantine Museum, when the first plans to establish the Byzantine Museum in Athens were opposed by many people in Greece, because they thought that religion is alive, and putting it in a museum would kill it. It would kill the Orthodox religion. So I wouldn't call it a Byzantine, but yes, there was a clash.
I mean, the whole 19th century mighty movement of building the grand narrative, the grand Pan-Hellenic narrative, was in fact more or less the same in Greece as in the other parts of Europe. That's what I'm trying to refer to. That in the local inhabitants were in fact much more attached to their lived and somehow still alive tradition than the classical one. So the classical tradition in Greece was, in modern Greece, was in fact somehow the consequence of the whole situation of the 19th century building of the narrative. I'm not imposing this idea. I'm testing this idea. I'm asking about your opinion on it, because that's not my idea. That's the one that I've met, that I've seen in literature. So yeah. I'm now asking you what you think about it.
Well, you know what? The ancient past was for some Greeks a kind of an ideal that was diffused into Greece through a few Enlightenment scholars and so on. Yes, otherwise Greeks lived as any inhabitant in the Ottoman Balkans. So it was like the rest of them. But you know what? This classist ideal, as much as it may have been artificial, imported, or anything, you know, sometimes ideas are more important. They play a role in history, which is
every tradition is artificial.
Yes.
So it makes it no less real.
I think the idea about the ancient Greek past was something to look up to. It was a kind that inspired. It was a source of inspiration.
Okay, thank you.
Dimitri, do you want to add something on this?
Yes, indeed. In the beginning, the late 19th century, there was a discussion. There was a serious debate in Greece between Greek scholars whether classical past ought to be revived or to be identified as the past, Greece's integral past. There's a continuation and not a revival. They went for the continuation paradigm, and then came the historians like Paparigopoulos, who created this seamless continuity narrative, incorporating Byzantium, which was the odd man out. They didn't know what to do with it. So once this was solved, and Paparigopoulos came up with this idea that Hellenic spirit sort of lay dormant for 1,000 years, but then came back up. Now, of course, all this was known because you asked about Michael Herzfeld and his ideas about the dual tradition. Michael's a friend of mine, and actually he's going to be in one of the future conferences. So when his ideas first came out, I think nobody noticed. He was this is his first book, Ours Once More. So he was writing his books, but no one read them in Greece. He became notorious when he wrote about crypto-colonialism in 2002, and this is something that Yorgos referred to when he was talking about the importation of classical tradition. In that book, in that paper, actually, he says that Greece is a crypto colony because it structures its world image based on somebody else's imagery, that somebody else has created classical Greece and you just adopt it. This was felt as an insult in Greece. There were very few of us who took him seriously, and actually Michael always says that I'm the only Greek archaeologist who takes him seriously in terms of the crypto-colonialist argument. However, since the recession and the austerity measures of 2008 onwards, it has become easier for us to teach about the colonization of Greek of the Hellenic ideal to our students, because they're more familiar with this concept that Greece is in fact a colony, a modern colony, a sort of a Western colony, whatever, financially and sort of metropolitan, dependent upon metropolitan centers. So though this concept was greatly debated in Greece, in Greek universities, and the many people today that are against it. This and the sort of the twin concept of intimacy, how do you call it? The
cultural intimacy.
Cultural intimacy. The idea that you project one tradition to the foreigners and you keep one for yourself. This sort of dual tradition. This is catching up, I think, with a younger generation of students and anthropologists. And I think no one really attacks this kind of ideas now, but there was a time in the 1990s and the early 2000s that many people were really upset at this suggestion. Also, which was extremely racist, the idea that someone like Hertzfeld would compare Greece to countries like Thailand, which was seen as offensive, as an insult.
Yes, I'm aware of that particular discussion. That's why I raised the issue, because I wanted to hear what do practitioners at this point.
Oh, I've had people
at this point.
People have stopped talking to me since 2003, 2004. Never talked to me again. When I said, but you know, this idea is pretty good, and let's stop. And people have stopped talking to me. You know. So.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a fuller picture. Thank you.
It seems to me that literary scholars, also Greek literary scholars, are much more open to this post-colonial or quasi-colonial discourse than historians in general. I mean, there are quite a few Greek literary scholars who actually speak in this through this post-colonial key about the Greek conceptualizations of history, rather than historians. But also, I think what is interesting is the clash of faculties. That is to say, for a very long time, for example, Byzantine studies was subsumed under classical studies, especially in the West. And there was a certain reaction on behalf of the Byzantinists against this classicizing, tendency. So there was also interfaculty clash here involved, I think. But,
may I also add the struggle to make to create a field of Byzantine archaeology as archaeology, not as art history, which has also been a very arduous task. I mean, when when the Americans tried to excavate the Frankish layers of Corinth in the so-called single context recording system, which is usually employed in prehistoric excavations, it was a kind of a revolution for the field. Or when they started studying, I don't know, pottery. Now they do a lot, but it's like 20 years ago, this was still considered something entirely novel.
Mhm.
Well, it still is in many parts. My excavation is in northern Greece, and when we started and we found many tombs of the mid to late 4th century AD, which were very important to us because they would date a later basilica on the site. So of course, as archaeologists, we decided to call a forensic archaeologist and study the bones, and we were all very happy because we were building up a database to compare our finds with, and then we realized that there were no late Roman or early Byzantine bones from Macedonia. That we were the first to do this in 2015 or so. There were massive cemeteries, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD cemeteries in the vicinity, in the area, with no bones in record at all.
On the other hand, if you allow me,
so the narrative does have a very strong impact on the research strategies, definitely.
if you allow me to make a short comment, I mean, Yorgos presented a case in which we have a Greek archaeology or Greek prehistory as a traditional plus. And I was thinking back to Alexander's presentation, and I thought that this plus is mainly because of the work of all these foreign schools, because if you see Yorgos's presentation, it was mainly about foreign archaeologists working in Greece. So it's not about the Greek archaeological paradigm, but it's something important. I mean, all these paradigms were imported, and there were very few archaeologists following, especially until the 90s, what was happening in the Western academia. Yorgos mentioned only 3 of them, Tsundas and Marinatos and Milonas. So I will come back to Alexander's presentation in the morning. I would say perhaps that even in the Greek case study, we would have some lost steps without the work of all these foreign scholars working in Greece. But of course, not affecting very much, especially in the first in the last decades of the 20th century, very much Greek archaeologists. And this is something that I would like to raise tomorrow with my presentation, to what extent all these new approaches and new paradigms affected Greek archaeologists working in Greece. I don't know if Alexander would say something of this, or Yorgos, but or Predrag, do you want to say something on it, or let's leave it for later? Yorgos? Okay.
Sorry, no, not for you. I have another question.
Okay, so let's.
I would only wish to point out that Jan, that yes, you are right. At the same time, however, we need to point out that even foreign archaeologists working in Greece, with exceptions, were also a bit reserved.
A bit
reserved.
Traditional.
I mean, even I was surprised when I saw. I mean, we all consider Renfrew's work to be a milestone, right? It's before and after Renfrew for many of us in Aegean prehistory. And then you sit down and read The Emergence of Civilization very carefully. And although he deconstructs any notion of culture historical approach to the Cyclades, he devotes so much of his book that you realize how important it has been to him. And after all, the book has been devoted to Gordon Childe. And then he was very good at steering through and having relations with the older paradigm. He worked with John Evans at Saliagos. John Evans was not as advanced as Colin Renfrew. And as I said, he worked with Maria Gimbutas at Sitagri. Once I asked him, how on earth could you and Maria Gimbutas work together? I mean, a world apart from each other. He smiled and said, well, we did very well. We went very well along with each other. Maria did her work, I did my work, and everything worked out fine. It's funny how, William MacDonald, who didn't take a cautious, this cautious direction, he went heads on against traditional archaeology, had less impact than Renfrew, who steered his way through traditional archaeology.
Let's have a comment or question from Predrag, please.
If there are no direct comments or questions on this, I would like to ask, maybe it's not something that you could answer me immediately, but how about the development and how into this story enters the archaeology of the Ottoman period or archaeology of the Ottoman heritage?
Hang on, you mean Ottoman monuments?
Yes, of the Ottoman period, let's say from the 14th, 15th century onwards.
Well, this is a very, this Ottoman material remains are a very interesting story, okay? Artifacts had the same fate as earlier, as Byzantine artifacts for many decades. They were just thrust away, okay? But this wasn't because they were Ottoman, because as I said, Byzantine artifacts had the same fate. We started becoming conscious of Ottoman period artifacts more or less right after we became conscious of Byzantine, let's say, pottery remains, okay? And I think there's a growing interest in them. Architecture, monuments themselves, like architecture, buildings, are a different issue because we had a lot of architectural historians, architects, and building conservators who dealt with them. So despite the unfortunate events of a few years ago when we had a fire in one of the most important Ottoman mosques we had in Greece, I would say that they have been, Ottoman remains have been treated. They have been preserved. And there are a few books on them, but it's a split field, you see. It's architectural history on the one hand, and it's the portable or the smaller sized material culture, which had been neglected until recently. And yeah, I'm not denying that, for example, in the 19th century, there was a kind of contrast, because if you have just broken away from the Ottoman Empire, you won't turn to study Ottoman material culture. But this is not the case anymore, I think, and since many years.
This I observe also in other countries which were under the Ottoman Empire for centuries, that Ottoman heritage was first and mostly something that the conservators and architects were doing, and this did not enter into archaeology easily. So it was this tradition of architectural and maybe art history analysis, and only very recently archaeology is trying to grasp also this subject, because many other reasons why it's also important to archaeologically approach to this.
Let me add one piece of information. The archaeological law still, and there, since the end of the 19th century, considers as listed artifacts, the ones until 1453, when Constantinople falls to the Ottomans, and then protects artifacts that are church artifacts, ecclesiastical and liturgical artifacts, automatically. For all the rest, you need to have a special report. An archaeologist has to file a special report. But this has, so this includes a lot, okay, in there.
Giorgio, can I add something on this? You're
Yes.
absolutely right, but according to the new law, which is actually regulates everything right now, concerning, I mean, even things after 1453, so up to 1830, is protected automatically as soon as it comes from excavation. So Ottoman finds, let's say, are protected by definition by the law as soon as they come from excavations. If they are, you know, somewhere in your house or, you know, perhaps it could not, I mean, it's not by ancient by definition, but as soon as they come from excavation, they are under automatic protection by the law. So perhaps this, sorry.
Yeah, Yanni, you're right, because many families have family heirlooms from the 19th century. So it would be pointless to try to figure out what is what.
So the Greek legislation after, actually the law is 2002, protects automatically everything before 1830, so including Ottoman finds, especially as soon as they are coming from excavations.
I have one last question. Sorry, I'll try
we
to
have
brief,
two more
I'm
questions
really...
actually, but okay, yes, Diana, please.
Sorry, very, very curious about this. When, if at all, did the paradigm shift actually took place in archaeology at any rate? I mean, is it in the first place related to some shift in the grand national narrative? It is often assumed that 1974, with the fall of the junta, then it's the real open up, the real discontinuity of sorts in the grand narrative, possibly related, or you will tell me possibly not related to actual archaeological practice, because before that, I mean, we have this long-term tradition from the 19th century through Metaxas, through the Civil War, etc., etc. Did indeed 1974 present a kind of caesura, a kind of, and what was it that came after, if anything? Was it intellectual pluralism? Was it an alternative national narrative? What was it? What is it that came after it, if anything?
Well, the fall of the junta did play a role, but I would say an indirect role, not a direct role. I should point out that Spiridon Marinatos died just before the junta fell. And I'm singling out Spiridon Marinatos because he had been the most you know, promoted Greek prehistorian at the time. And actually he had been employed by the junta governments as the head of the archaeological service. So all these did play a role. And then Remfru's book comes out in 1972. So it coincides more or less, it's 2 years before the fall of the junta. So when it starts catching up, everything, Greece is a different place than it had been. And this, and at the same time, there's a democratic but right-wing government, which is in favor of, let's say, Western schools of archaeology, such as the Americans and the British, who spearheaded the paradigm shift towards new or processual archaeology in the ever since. So yes, there is, but indirectly, the Greek universities, of course, became a very lively place of discussion. I would also think that voices like Yorgos Kourmouziadis' Marxist approach found ground in this new world in a way. So yes, I would say that the fall of the junta did result into multivocality, but not in a very tight cause and effect manner, in the wider sense.
Can we move on with a question by Monica? And then by, yes.
I will be quick. I just wanted to ask, so are there any particular courses at the departments of archaeology where students can learn something about post-medieval archaeology or Ottoman archaeology? So that's, as I understand, that's part of research, but not part of the curricula. And as far as I know, only in Slovenia, there are courses where we can find those subjects of post-medieval archaeology. And we in Serbia have the same problem here. So I would also want to ask what happened in that regard in Turkey. That would be interesting to know.
Well, let me say that I was taught Ottoman architecture. Mm-hmm. All three of us were taught Ottoman architecture when we were students. So,
yes,
and that's a while ago. So yes.
Also, Ottoman history. Ottoman history
yes.
is widely taught in many Greek universities.
Yes, it's true.
It's not always easy because there are backlashes, even by politicians, and there have been in the past, even in the recent past. But yes, it is a recognized discipline in Greece.
But just the monuments and let's say history, and not small findings and contextual approach as we do, for example, in prehistoric archaeology.
Yes, there's less on artifacts than on monuments and history, but still, I mean, as Dimitris says and Jan said, now as everything, whatever we find in excavations is studied so properly, and all this pours back into everybody's teaching in the university. It hasn't been highlighted, but it hasn't been downplayed either, let's say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Perhaps we can close this discussion with Denise. You're a perfect person to close this.
Thank you. Maybe I can first respond to Monica's question, what's the situation in Turkey in terms of Ottoman archaeology? There has been a new department established, Turkish Islamic Archaeology Department in one of the private universities. And this is the first and only department which focuses on Turkish Selçuk Ottoman archaeology. But I'm not surprised that Ottoman period is taught through monuments and I mean, it's architecture and history, because Ottoman archaeology is not in existence or has not been in existence. And the whole Selçuk and Ottoman period has been seen through monumentality, architecture, and maybe urban development from that perspective. And I would like to go back to the previous discussion and not ask a question, but make a comment on what's going on in Turkey in terms of Byzantine archaeology or Ottoman archaeology. And it's that also in Turkey, both of these periods are studied by art historians. They're studied in art history departments, and the few excavations, maybe 6, 7, 8 excavations with the objective of studying Byzantine period, understanding Byzantine period, are primarily conducted under art history departments. And when we presented our Selçuk period pottery for a PhD dissertation to one of the art history departments, they were quite pleased and content by the fact that this material was coming from a stratigraphic excavation instead of a collection in a museum or in a collector's, a private collection. So I think Byzantine archaeology and Islamic archaeology, I don't think it even exists. Art history depends on material culture in the museums and private collections, dependent on private collections and museums, and stratigraphic excavations and archaeological theory and approaches have not made its way into these studies in Turkey. Although it's improving, I wanted to make this point. Thank you.
There is nothing else. I think we can finish with the afternoon session. And the organizers, perhaps Alec, Dimitris, Diana, if you want to say some things about tomorrow. You want to officially declare then?
Dimitris, maybe you want to say a few words, then I'll...
Certainly. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Yanis, and thank you, everyone, for this amazing selection of papers we had today. We were hoping, when we were planning this conference more than almost 2 years ago now, we were hoping precisely for this kind of opportunity to discuss archaeologies in our region through their individual narratives and individual storytelling exercises, to perhaps be able to follow archaeology in Southeastern Europe from post-romantic baby steps to nationalist integration. And today we had a lot of that. We had a good set of introductions to regional archaeologies, and I hope that tomorrow would be equally rewarding. Of course, the aim is eventually to formulate ourselves some idea of where we want this to go. Ways we can apply this knowledge with this knowledge we have gathered in order to perform our own paradigm shift, but perhaps that is too much to ask just yet.
Yes, I just want to back up Dimitris, both in I mean, the good mood that the good vibes that are around, and this craving for discussion and for raising questions and so on. This is really very encouraging and very nice to see. But also, indeed, in the course of the day tomorrow, it will be really nice if you could think of indeed how to proceed from here, and to, at the end of the day tomorrow, to possibly suggest some tentative ways where we can go and what we can possibly do together or in smaller groups or even individually, but indeed how to use this momentum and this kind of network, quite informal, of course, network of people with common interests and common understanding about the actual state of the art and the problems that this profession is facing. I think that no other issues has remained for the time being. Thank you very much. The last half an hour was fully open for just everyone to speak up, and so we are half an hour late, but it's the end of the day. Tomorrow we will meet at 10:30 local time, 9:30 Central European time, and we will continue. Unless you have other questions, we can probably close today's session.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
See everyone
very much.
tomorrow.
Good evening. Can see you tomorrow.